The rain hammered against the windows of Mercy General Hospital with relentless fury. Natalia Reeves pulled her cardigan tighter as she walked through the dimly lit corridor of the private wing. At 29 years old, she had spent the last 7 years perfecting the art of night shift nursing. While her colleagues complained about the lonely hours, Natalia found peace in them. Fewer distractions meant more time to truly care for the people who needed her most. Her sneakers squeaked softly against the polished floor as she approached the nurse's station. The clock on the wall showed 11:47 p.m., 3 more hours until her break. She was reviewing patient charts when her supervisor, Patricia, appeared with an unusual expression. "Natalia, I need you to take over room 512, Patricia said, her voice lower than normal. "New admission, car accident, stable condition but requesting absolute privacy." Natalia looked up from her paperwork. "Privacy requests aren't that unusual here." "This one is different," Patricia continued, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "He refused to provide his full name, signed every confidentiality agreement we have. Administration personally approved his admission. Just be professional and don't ask questions." Curiosity flickered in Natalia's mind, but she simply nodded. In 7 years, she had learned that wealthy patients often came with complicated lives they preferred to keep hidden. Marriages, scandals, business dealings gone wrong. She respected their privacy because everyone deserved dignity in their most vulnerable moments. First encounter. Natalia gathered her supplies and headed to room 512. She knocked softly before entering, giving whoever was inside a moment to prepare. The room was darker than usual, with only a small lamp casting warm light across the space. The man in the bed was younger than she expected, mid-30s perhaps. Dark hair fell across his forehead in waves that suggested he usually kept it carefully styled. A nasty bruise colored his left cheekbone purple and blue, and a bandage covered his right forearm. Despite his injuries, there was something striking about him. Strong jawline, broad shoulders that strained against the hospital gown, and eyes that caught the lamplight like polished stones. "Good evening," Natalia said gently, approaching with her tablet. "I'm Natalia Reeves. I'll be your nurse tonight. How are you feeling?" The man shifted slightly, wincing as he did. "Like I had an argument with a steering wheel and lost." His voice was deep, touched with humor despite obvious discomfort. Natalia smiled as she began checking his vital signs. "The steering wheel always wins that fight. Any pain I should know about? Sharp pains? Difficulty breathing? Nausea?" "Nothing I can't handle," he replied, watching her work with unusual intensity. "Bravery or stubbornness?" Natalia asked, noting his elevated heart rate on her tablet. "Probably both." A hint of a smile crossed his face. "You can call me James." Natalia noticed the slight pause, the way he seemed to choose that name carefully. But she had promised not to pry. "All right, James. The doctor's notes say you were lucky. The accident could have been much worse." "Luck." He repeated the word as if tasting something bitter. That's one way to describe it. There was weight in those words, a heaviness that made Natalia pause in her work. She had heard that tone before, usually from patients carrying burdens far heavier than physical injuries. "Well, lucky or not, you're here now, and my job is to make sure you heal properly." "You take this seriously," James observed. "Most nurses just check the boxes and leave." "People aren't boxes to be checked," Natalia replied simply, adjusting his IV drip. "They're human beings having difficult experiences. The least I can do is treat them that way." James studied her for a long moment, and Natalia felt oddly exposed under his gaze. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was intense, like he was seeing something in her that most people missed. Unexpected connection. Over the next hour, as Natalia completed her initial assessment and made James comfortable, she found herself drawn into conversation. It started professionally enough, questions about his medical history and current symptoms, but somehow, between checking bandages and adjusting pillows, it became something more. "How long have you been a nurse?" James asked as she prepared his medication. 7 years here at Mercy General, started right after finishing school." "Always wanted to be a nurse?" Natalia paused, measuring out pills into a small cup. Most patients didn't ask about her life. "I wanted to help people. Nursing seemed like the most direct way to do that. Seemed? He caught the past tense. Not anymore? I still help people, Natalia said carefully, but it's more complicated than I thought at 22. The system, the politics, the insurance battles. Sometimes it feels like I'm fighting just to give people basic care. But you keep fighting, James noted. Why? Natalia handed him the medication cup and a glass of water. Because someone has to, and because between all the complications, there are moments that matter. Moments when you actually make a difference in someone's life. James took the pills, his eyes never leaving her face. You're easy to talk to, Natalia realized. She had shared more in 20 minutes than she usually did in 20 days. Dangerously easy. James smiled, a real smile that transformed his whole face despite the bruises. Is that a warning? Maybe, Natalia stood, suddenly aware of how close they had been sitting. For both of us. Shadows of something more. As the night wore on, Natalia found herself returning to room 512 more often than necessary, checking vitals that didn't need checking, adjusting pillows that were already comfortable, making conversation that went beyond medical necessity. James seemed equally drawn to these interactions. He asked about her childhood, her favorite books, her dreams beyond nursing, and slowly, carefully, he shared pieces of himself, his love of architecture, his complicated relationship with family expectations, his sense of being trapped in a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt hollow within. Ever feel like you're playing a role? James asked around 3 a.m. when the hospital was at its quietest. Like the person everyone sees isn't really you. Natalia thought about it, standing by the window watching rain streak down the glass. Sometimes, when I'm so tired that I can barely stand, but I'm smiling because that's what nurses do. When I'm worried about bills but pretending everything is fine so Tom doesn't stress. Exactly, James said, except imagine doing that every moment of every day, never being able to let the mask slip because too many people depend on the performance. There was such loneliness in his voice that Natalia turned from the window. In the dim light, James looked younger, more vulnerable, like the successful veneer he usually wore had cracked, revealing someone who just wanted to be seen. Well, for whatever it's worth, you don't have to perform for me. I've seen people at their worst. Nothing scares me. James reached out, his hand hovering near hers on the bed rail. Rest, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You need to heal. Will you come back? James asked. Tomorrow night? I'm always here tomorrow night, Natalia replied with a small smile. Night shift is my permanent home. As Natalia left room 512, her heart was beating faster than it should. She told herself it was just compassion, just the natural human response to someone in pain. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Something had sparked between them in that quiet hospital room, something that felt dangerous and inevitable and utterly impossible to ignore. What Natalia didn't know was the man in room 512 wasn't just another patient seeking privacy. He was James Montgomery, founder and CEO of the Montgomery Health Systems, the corporation that owned Mercy General and 47 other hospitals across the country. And when she discovered the truth, everything would change.
3 nights had passed since James arrived at Mercy General, and Natalia found herself counting down the hours until her shift began. She told herself it was just professional concern, that she cared about all her patients equally. But the truth sat heavy in her chest every time she walked through those hospital doors. She was thinking about him constantly. James was healing quickly. The bruises had faded from deep purple to yellowish green. The cut on his arm was closing nicely. By all medical standards, he would be discharged within 2 days. The thought made Natalia feel something uncomfortably close to sadness. "You're distracted tonight," Patricia observed as Natalia prepared her medication cart. "Everything okay?" Natalia forced a smile. "Just tired. Tom has exams coming up. He's been calling with questions at all hours." It wasn't entirely a lie. Thomas had called 3 times yesterday, stressed about his thermodynamics final. But that wasn't what occupied her thoughts as she pushed the cart toward room 512. She knocked softly before entering. James was sitting up in bed, wearing the hospital gown, but looking more alert and energized than previous nights. A laptop sat open on the table in front of him, though he closed it quickly when she entered. "Working?" Natalia asked, raising an eyebrow as she approached. "Old habits," James replied with a slightly guilty smile. "I'm not good at sitting still." "Clearly." Natalia began her routine checks, wrapping the blood pressure cuff around his arm. "Your body needs rest to heal, you know. That includes your brain." "My brain is the hardest part to shut off," James admitted, watching her work. "It just keeps running, analyzing, planning. Sometimes I wish I had an off switch." Natalia felt his pulse steady and strong beneath her fingers. "Have you tried meditation, reading, anything that forces you to slow down?" "I've tried everything," James said. "Nothing works, except talking to you." The admission hung in the air between them. Natalia's hands stilled on the blood pressure monitor. Their eyes met, and she saw something in his gaze that made her breath catch. Vulnerability. Hope. Something that looked dangerously like affection. "Your blood pressure is good," she said, breaking eye contact and focusing on her tablet. "Professional. Stay professional. Heart rate is normal. How's the pain level?" "Better," though he sounded disappointed by her retreat into clinical distance. "The arm barely hurts anymore." "That's good news." Natalia made notes on her tablet, aware of his eyes following her every movement. "You'll be out of here soon, back to your regular life." "Right," James said quietly. "My regular life." There was something bitter in those words, but before Natalia could respond, her tablet buzzed with an alert. Another patient needed medication. Duty called. "I'll check on you later," she said, already moving toward the door. "Natalia," his voice stopped her at the threshold. "Thank you for treating me like a person. Not everyone does." She turned back, confused by the statement. Why wouldn't they? James opened his mouth as if to explain, then seemed to think better of it. "No reason, just thank you." Cracks in the facade. Later that night, around 2 a.m., Natalia was finishing paperwork at the nurse's station when she heard raised voices from down the hall. Not quite shouting, but urgent and tense. She looked up to see two men in expensive suits standing outside room 512, engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion. One was the man who had visited before, the one James called Carlos. The other was older, gray-haired, with the bearing of someone accustomed to be obeyed. They spoke in low tones, but Natalia caught fragments as she approached. "The board meeting cannot wait any longer," the gray-haired man was saying. 3 days is already unprecedented." "He was in an accident," Carlos replied firmly. "Give him time to recover." "Time we don't have. The shareholders are getting nervous. They need to see him, need reassurance that Montgomery Health Systems isn't in crisis." Natalia's steps faltered. Montgomery Health Systems, the corporation that owned this hospital, that owned dozens of hospitals, one of the largest healthcare companies in the country. "Excuse me," she said, finding her voice, despite the sudden roaring in her ears. "Can I help you, gentlemen? You're disturbing other patients." Both men turned to her. The gray-haired man looked annoyed at the interruption. Carlos, however, looked almost panicked. "We were just leaving," Carlos said quickly, putting a hand on the other man's arm. "Mr. Hendricks, we can discuss this tomorrow at the office." "There might not be a company tomorrow if we keep hiding," Hendricks snapped, but he allowed himself to be led away. Natalia stood frozen in the corridor, her mind racing. Montgomery Health Systems. James. Could it be a coincidence? A common name? But even as she tried to convince herself, pieces started falling into place. The extreme privacy requests, the expensive visitors, the way James talked about being trapped by expectations, about never being able to let his mask slip, the way he seemed to know so much about hospital operations, about the politics and complications of healthcare. Her hands were shaking as she walked to room 512. She knocked softly before entering. James was sitting up in bed, wearing the hospital gown, but looking more alert and energized than previous nights. A laptop sat open on the table in front of him, though he closed it quickly when she entered. "Working?" Natalia asked, raising an eyebrow as she approached. "Old habits," James replied with a slightly guilty smile. "I'm not good at sitting still." "Clearly." Natalia began her routine checks, wrapping the blood pressure cuff around his arm. "Your body needs rest to heal, you know. That includes your brain." My brain is the hardest part to shut off, James admitted, watching her work. It just keeps running, analyzing, planning. Sometimes I wish I had an off switch. Natalia felt his pulse steady and strong beneath her fingers. Have you tried meditation, reading, anything that forces you to slow down? I've tried everything, James said. Nothing works, except talking to you.
Natalia had called in sick for the first time in 3 years. She spent the day in her small apartment, alternating between crying, sleeping, and staring at the ceiling. Thomas had called twice, sensing something was wrong, but she convinced him she just had a migraine. How could she explain that her heart was breaking over a man she had known for less than a week? By evening, restlessness drove her from bed. She made tea she didn't drink and tried to read a book she couldn't focus on. Her mind kept replaying every conversation with James, searching for signs she should have noticed, clues she should have caught. But there had been nothing. He had been careful, maintaining his disguise perfectly while making her feel seen in ways she never had before. Around 8 p.m., her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Hello? Natalia. James's voice came through the line, and her heart immediately started racing. Please don't hang up. How did you get my personal number? She asked, though her voice lacked the anger she wanted to feel. I'm the CEO of your employer, James said, and she could hear the self-deprecating tone. I have access to employee records, which I know is an abuse of power, and I'm sorry, but I'm being discharged in 2 hours, and I couldn't leave without talking to you. Natalia closed her eyes, fighting the urge to simply listen to his voice and forgive everything. What is there to talk about? You lied. I found out. End of story. It doesn't have to be, James said quietly. Can I see you? Just once, face to face, so I can explain properly? I don't think that's appropriate, Natalia replied, even as part of her desperately wanted to say yes. You're my employer, James. There are boundaries we've already crossed that could get me fired. You won't get fired, James said firmly. I promise you that. No matter what happens between us, your job is secure. But, Natalia, please, give me one chance to explain everything. If you still want nothing to do with me after that, I'll respect it. I'll never contact you again. The thought of never hearing from him again sent a sharp pain through her chest, which was ridiculous. She barely knew him. Except that wasn't true. She knew his loneliness, his intelligence, his dry humor. She knew the way his eyes lit up when he talked about architecture, the way he listened like every word she said mattered. She knew the parts of him he had chosen to show her, even if she didn't know the full picture. Where? She heard herself ask. There's a coffee shop 3 blocks from the hospital, the Sunrise Cafe. Can you meet me there in an hour? Natalia looked down at her pajamas, at her tear-stained face reflected in the darkened window. I look terrible. I doubt that's possible, James said softly. But, Natalia, I don't care what you look like. I just need to see you. The meeting. The Sunrise Cafe was nearly empty when Natalia arrived. She had changed into jeans and a simple sweater, pulled her hair into a ponytail, and tried to cover the evidence of her crying with makeup. She felt exposed and vulnerable as she pushed through the door. Thomas sat at a corner table, wearing civilian clothes for the first time since she had met him. Dark jeans, a gray sweater that emphasized his broad shoulders, leather jacket draped over the chair. He looked different outside the hospital. More real somehow, more human. He stood when he saw her, and Natalia noticed the tension in his posture, the careful way he moved as if afraid she might bolt. Thank you for coming, he said as she approached. Can I get you something? Coffee? Tea? I'm fine, Natalia said, sitting down across from him. She needed to maintain some distance, some control over a situation that felt completely out of her hands. James sat slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. You look beautiful, he said quietly. Don't, Natalia replied, shaking her head. Don't do that. Don't try to charm me or compliment me into forgetting why I'm angry. You're right, James said immediately. I'm nervous and I'm falling back on old habits. Let me start over. He took a deep breath. My name is James Montgomery. I'm 36 years old. I founded Montgomery Health Systems when I was 24 with money I inherited from my grandfather. In 12 years, I built it into one of the largest healthcare corporations in the country. I work 16-hour days, I have almost no friends, and I haven't had a real relationship in over 8 years. Natalia listened, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The accident happened because I was driving myself home from the office at midnight, exhausted and not paying enough attention. I hit a patch of ice and spun out. Could have been much worse, but I was lucky. When they brought me to Mercy General, I realized nobody there knew who I was. And for the first time in years, I had a chance to just be James. Not the CEO, not the billionaire, not the guy everyone wants something from, just a person. So you took that chance, without thinking about how it might affect anyone else, Natalia said. Without thinking at all, James admitted. I just wanted a few days of being normal, of having conversations that weren't about profit margins or board meetings. I didn't plan to meet someone like you. I didn't plan to feel the way I felt. And how did you feel? Natalia asked, hating how much she needed to hear his answer. James leaned forward, his eyes intense and sincere. Like I had found something I didn't even know I was looking for. Like for the first time in my adult life, someone was seeing me and not my bank account. You talked to me about real things, your struggles, your hopes, your love for your brother. You treated me with kindness that wasn't calculated or performed. And every time you walked into that room, I felt more alive than I had in years. Natalia felt tears threatening again. That's not fair, she whispered.